So, as I trust you know, this past Saturday, we observed the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And on that Shabbat, it was just, the weather was just beautiful. It was a crisp day. It was sunny and clear, and it was just striking how reminiscent it was of the weather 20 years ago. And it's also striking that we could remember the weather from a single day 20 years ago. And at Shabbat services, unbidden, almost everybody who was there took a moment to share a memory at some point, either during services or afterwards, about what was happening for them that day. I'm guessing that's true for a lot of you as well. And I'm confident in saying that if you're old enough to remember, you remember 9/11. So I was in Philadelphia. I was in my last year of rabbinical school, and I remember a secretary came into my class and handed my professor, Rabbi David Teutsch, a note, and he read it to the class that the first tower had been struck. And then he explained to us that the most important response to acts of terror was for us to continue business as usual, and he continued his class. And we were all a little bit in shock, and during the break we went outside to another part of the building where there was a TV going, and we sat and we watched the two towers fall. And we did not go back to class. We just went home. So I'm not going to speak about 9/11 today. But before I go on, I do just want to acknowledge that how traumatic that day was for so many of us. I know that there are people in this community who just did heroic things on that day. And I know that there are people in this community who were literally, whose lives were saved in heroic ways on that day. And that many people experienced loss, and that almost all of us were afraid. And there is a sense, I think, that many of us had on that day that our world would forever be divided from what came before that day and what came after. So for today, all I'm asking you to do is just remember how much, just notice how much you remember of that day and that feeling of divide between before and after. So it might not be quite as clear for you, but I want to try and do the same thing about thinking about when you realize that COVID-19, that the pandemic was going to be a similar moment, that it would divide everything that came before it, the before times, right, from after. So I remember debating with my rabbinical association about whether, and ultimately choosing to, cancel our rabbinical association conference where I was supposed to be elected president. My parents were going to come and celebrate the honor. I was still elected president, but by Zoom. I remember in the last Montclair Clergy Association meeting before the pandemic, all of us discussing what should happen. And Rabbi Ariane and I sort of took two polls debating whether or not we should continue to have in-person services or not. And everybody listened rapidly because everybody was having those same conversations until the next weekend when we at B'nai Keshet were streaming and everybody else was streaming. It was just, the decision was done. I remember my wife, Sarah, coming home from the grocery store with bags of dried beans and rice. And I remember her just looking stricken, like so concerned that she'd been in these lines with so many people and had she made a mistake, and like our clarity that we were just going to live off of what was in the pantry and in the freezer for as long as we could. So maybe you remember it a little differently. Maybe it's sharper or not so sharp. But I'm pretty sure that you can remember before and after. And I know that we, and as a community, and many of you as individuals, there was just heroic actions taken to try and face this challenge. Okay, so now, I want to ask you to remember when you first learned that we were approaching a climate disaster, right? That the coral reefs are dying, that the ice caps are melting, that there are actual islands that are starting to sink into the sea, that there are many, 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 many species on the precipice of disaster. So try, if you can, to remember the day that that sunk in, when you realized that we were on the brink of climate catastrophe. The moment before, when you took the future of life on Earth for granted, and then the moment after, when it began to sink in that it's actually possible we could be one of the last generations of humanity. Do you remember that day? I don't remember that day, right? I think most of us don't remember that day. The phrase le dor va dor means from one generation to the next. When we pray these words during the Amidah, we are affirming that we have a role to play in passing down the traditions of Judaism from generation to generation to generation. And a lot of you, many, many of you have shared with me that one of the most profound things for you about being Jewish is that sense of inheriting this deep tradition from our ancestors and of being a link from generation to generation. We're at a moment when we need to ask ourselves how we can be good links, how we can be good ancestors to future generations. Because climate change, it's causing more death and more disruption than COVID-19. Bloomberg News reported this year that this year alone, more people died from climate change-related things than all of those who have died of COVID-19. Now, I don't know how they did that math, and I'm not going to give a bunch of statistics in this sermon, because I know that you are all intelligent people, and you read the newspapers, the same papers I do, and that the fact is you've seen it unfolding in your lifetime. None of us like to face it, but my guess is that you know in your heart that the world is in danger. So I'll just say a few moments where it started to sink in for me recently. A couple of years ago, when fires in California destroyed so many places that I grew up going to camping with my parents, but in particular, the Jewish summer camp that I went to, and seeing images of that camp with all the artwork, all the crafts, all the buildings just incinerated, just burnt to the ground. Hearing bitterness and anguish in the voices of so many young people who just like are cynical about the possibility that there's going to be a world that's worth preserving for their children. Most recently noticing that more people died from Hurricane Ida in our region, in New York and in New Jersey, than in Louisiana. So think about it. When are some moments that it began to sink in for you that we're heading towards a climate catastrophe? We're heading towards climate change that will be more world-changing than 9/11 was, but that until recently has been just moving at a completely, entirely different pace. If we look up to the sky and we look at the clouds and we are patient, we can see them move. And if we keep staring into the sky for long enough, maybe we can see the sky clear, or maybe we can see a storm roll in. If you pay attention over just many, many years, you can watch a tree grow. If we're lucky enough, we can see, we can live long enough to see a generation born and moving out into the world, starting their lives, having their own children. After a few decades, we can start to notice ourselves aging. So the last major extinction of species on this planet was 65 million years ago. And the other 4 mass extinctions were hundreds of millions of years ago. And with the exclusion of the most recent that killed the dinosaurs, climate scientists now believe that every other mass extinction was caused by climate change. And the most massive of these, which has the unfortunate but very descriptive nickname, the Great Dying. It has that nickname because 95% of marine animals died. 95%. And 70% of all land animals died. And it was caused by global warming, by acidification of the oceans, by a depletion in the world's oxygen that happened over thousands of years. And all of those things are happening right now, but at speeds that could outstrip that disaster in decades, not in millennia. A lot of scientists think that we are already in the midst of the next mass extinction. And this one, again, I don't think I'm telling you something you don't know, but this one is caused by global warming, caused by humans. It's primarily because of the burning of fossil fuels. And it's happening at lightning speed geologically, but for so much of our lives, we could just barely see it at a generational level. Maybe you've noticed that it seems like it's speeding up. Like it's not a generational thing, it's a yearly thing. For me this year, when I read the Unatana Tokef, the prayer that we sing on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur about who will live and who will die, it lost its power as a metaphor because it just seemed like reality. Like I was reading newspaper headlines. Who dies by fire? Who dies by drowning? Who by hunger? Who by thirst? It is completely understandable that many of us, at least, can't remember the day that we realized that we're heading towards climate disaster. But I'm really hoping that that will change. That maybe, at least for this community, that in years to come, we'll remember this year of Shemitah, when we give the land a break, this year when our congregation has decided to focus on the theme of creation, that we'll remember this year is the year that separates the time before and after, before we realized that we were facing catastrophe, and after we began the creative work together to limit this catastrophe and, God willing, to avert it. So one of my favorite sources on this is the great climate activist Joanna Macy. And she is somebody who just lived the life. You can't believe somebody could do so much in a life. She was in the CIA in the 1950s. She helped her husband form the Peace Corps. She resettled Tibetan refugees in India, where she met the Dalai Lama and many other leaders of the Tibetan Buddhist community. She's taught all around the world. She teaches this spiritually grounded approach to nonviolence and to facing climate change. And she teaches that to face climate change, that the very first thing we have to do is to stop repressing our grief and all the anger that we have about it. Because the other side of that pain about all the things that are being caused by this destruction is actually all of the love, all of the appreciation we have for the world that we live in and for all this love that we have for what it means to be alive. She asks that we consider this question: what breaks your heart about the danger the world is facing? What are your fears for the next generation? So, to address climate change, Joanna Macy teaches that we need to understand 3 stories. And these 3 stories she calls business as usual, the great unraveling, and the great turning. Most of us swing back and forth between the first 2 of these stories, between business as usual and the great unraveling. We're in business as usual story. When we're there, we see little need for change. We accept that economic growth is something that's essential. We see clearly that our world is filled with people who are doing better and people who are doing worse, with winners and losers. And even though many of us are dedicated to trying to do what we can for those people who are disproportionately suffering, who are doing worse, we actually put the majority of our energy into being on the side of the people who are doing better, being on the side of the winners. So when we're living in the middle of business as usual, which we're all doing almost all the time, it's easy to think that this is just always the way things were. We tell young people that there's not really an alternative. We encourage them to find their place in the scheme of things. We encourage each other to focus on our own needs rather than the bigger problems in the world. And for most of us, it's a pretty attractive, there's a lot that's attractive about this world. A lot. But the thing is that the airplanes and our cars and the exponential growth in the way we use electricity and the cooling agents in our refrigerators and our air conditioners, and especially the assumption that above all else the economy must grow, that we have a duty to produce, that we have an obligation to consume, all those things are contributing to the great unraveling of the world that we so value. When we're in the story of the great unraveling, it draws our attention to the disasters that business as usual is taking us toward and in many cases has already brought. It's an account backed by evidence of the collapse of ecological and social systems, of disturbances in our climate, of depletion of resources, of mass extinction of species. But the unraveling is just so overwhelming, it's so hard to grasp, it's so diffuse that we tend to look away, we tend to suppress our fear. It's just moving slowly enough that we allow it to be sidelined by other also important issues. And it's overwhelming enough that we look for distractions. And there are so many distractions, right? So many things drawing our attention. But it's important to remember, it wasn't always like this, that business as usual is really just the norms that our society has adopted since the Industrial Revolution. Just not even a few hundred years. And it's also important, Joanna Macy teaches, to recognize that the instability that is arising right now because of this great unraveling also brings with it the potential for dramatic positive changes. Joanna Macy calls this story the great turning. So I don't know if I'll ever get a chance to meet Joanna Macy. If I do, I have to know whether she chose the name the great turning, knowing that the Hebrew word for repentance, tshuva, means turning. That's why we all came today, right? We came to do tshuva. We came prepared to return to our souls, to turn our lives to more wholesome directions. But I want to ask us to also engage in a collective tshuva, in a collective turning of society, a great turning. So the thing is that just as most of us, a lot of the time, are participating in business as usual and have moments of noticing the great unraveling, we are also participating in a great turning. Whenever we recognize the story of business as usual and the way it's leading us to catastrophe, Whenever we refuse to let the second story, the story of the great unraveling, have the last word, we're participating in the great turning. There's a lot of ways so many of us are doing this. For you, it might be that you started a garden, or that you buy organic foods. It might be that you chose to buy a more energy-efficient car, or have looked into green energy for your home, or put up solar panels. Maybe you're just trying to use less plastics. These are personal choices, and they're important because they're small moments of facing the destruction that's happening in the world. We wouldn't do them if we didn't see that. They're moments where we are trying to bring our actions into alignment with our aspirations. And they are healing, and they're healing in the way that prayer is healing. And they help us practicing stopping, just like Shabbat helps us to practice stopping. And they help us to align our vision towards a just world just the same way a Passover Seder does. And they can be life-changing, like prayer and fasting on Yom Kippur. But they will not be enough by themselves to begin the kind of turning, the kind of tshuva that's required to avert this disaster. I've dedicated my life to prayer, to Jewish ritual, because I know that these practices have extraordinary power, that they can change our lives, that they can change how we live in the world. But as the climate journalist Bill McKibben writes, the climate crisis no longer yields to individual action. There is no way to make the math work one Tesla, one vegan dinner at a time. So in 2020, when almost all of the world was at home, was shut down, homebound, carbon dioxide emissions fell about 7%. The other 93% of emissions just were baked into our infrastructure. They kept going even when nobody flew, even when nobody was driving. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that to avert climate disaster, it recommends that we cut emissions by about the amount, that 7%, that was when no one was driving or flying, that we do that this year, all year, and then another 7% the next year, and then another 7% the next year. We need to cut carbon dioxide emissions by 47% by 2020. That's an enormous, enormous amount. So much. A close colleague of mine, Rabbi Jenny Rosen, who founded Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action, puts it this way. We need to not just focus on what car do I buy, but on what cars are manufactured. Not on how do I get to work, but on what public transportation is being built and for what kind of work. We need to ask not just where do I bank, but why are the biggest banks in the world pouring trillions of dollars into fossil fuels, and how do we stop them? I spoke to another friend of mine, Reverend Fletcher Harper, who's the executive director of Green Faith. And he said that it would be a sin of omission for me to not say this clearly. We face a climate emergency because the fossil fuel industry has put its own profits above the well-being of humanity and above the well-being of the planet. It is true. It's true that industrial agriculture and deforestation are also to blame, but the fossil fuel industry has spent massive amounts to deceive the public, to lobby, and to block earth-saving change. And they've systematically targeted vulnerable communities, communities that already bear the brunt of coal and oil and gas operations. And our governments all over the world, including ours, they've either supported the destruction or they've kind of played both sides of the fence. And banks, they're still bankrolling the problem. And all of these enormous institutions, with all of their massive power, they just dwarf the other causes of the climate crisis. From one generation to the next, le dor va dor. We have to ask ourselves, what will future generations inherit from us? When we sing on this holiday, Adonai, Adonai el Rahum v'Chanun, we declare this beautiful thing. We declare that God's kindness extends to the 1,000th generation. And we imply that we can influence the universe to bring about that kind of kindness. It's such a powerful action that such a powerful thought that our actions could impact the universe in ways that would extend kindness for 1,000 generations. What we don't sing is the very next line, which is actually written in Exodus, which declares that our sins will impact our children's children's children, right? It's just too rough of a kind of truth when we're trying to do our best to focus on the positive side of change, on praying for forgiveness. But when we face this kind of climate change, to me, that line from Exodus, it just feels gentle. It feels almost euphemistic. The choices we are making right now, the choices that will be made in the next 5 years, they will determine the fate of generations for thousands of years. Le dor va dor. What will future generations say about our efforts to turn away from constant production, to turn toward sustainability, to turn from constant depletion of the Earth's resources, and turn toward replenishment? Our generation has a heroic task in front of us. It will require creativity at an existential level. The major climate treaties, they are just not even enough. They are at best a reflection about what was politically possible when they were signed. And as Jews, as a community, we have an obligation to creatively envision a moral criteria that is up to the weight of our own inherited tradition. Criteria that will assure that we can actually pass down blessings and not curses to the next generation. We have to embrace criteria like an immediate end to any new fossil fuels being taken from the ground. We have to embrace criteria like an end to all deforestation, divestment from fossil fuel industries. We have to be ready to embrace what it will take for us to generously welcome climate refugees. There are going to be millions of them. We have to embrace funds for developing countries from nations like ours who are responsible for the lion's share of the emissions that have ever gone into the universe. We have to demand that there is accessible and renewable energy for absolutely every person, but there are 700 million people in the earth right now who are living without electricity. We have to commit to the massive effort that's going to be needed to rebuild the way we have structured our whole civilization. This is a heroic task, and it is required of us. It will happen one step at a time. And the very first step that we have to take, the very first step is tshuva. We have to create a turning in the story of our lives. A turning that marks the moment before we knew that a heroic effort would be required of us, and after we began the heroic work necessary for a story that we could proudly know would be told le dor va dor for generations to come. May we and all of humanity, all of the earth, be sealed for a good year, a year of blessing. Amen.